Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today for this webinar, Redundancy and How to Avoid the Pitfalls. This webinar will be presented by Margaret Balsillie, who is the Workplace Relations Team Leader here at Jobs Australia. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please type them in the question box and Margaret will respond post-webinar. I would now like to hand over to our presenter, Margaret.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for attending today's webinar. So just a little bit about the program. As we know, in the world in which we work, uncertainty and change are absolute facts of life, especially for the not-for-profit community sector. So with funding ebbs and flows and programs that come and go, for example, from time to time, organisations need to cease or reduce particular programs, with the result that some positions may become redundant. However, these factors do not reduce the obligation on non-profit organisations with regard to redundancy. So not-profit organisations have the same obligations to follow the Fair Work Act 2009, appropriate awards and other relevant legislation, as does any other employer. So we should also be mindful of the ethical requirements that we have to treat affected staff fairly. So good processes also sends an important signal to other staff that are not necessarily impacted and who will stay with the business. So I think we need to consider those factors as well, because the negative impact of a badly managed redundancy restructure process can have a destabilising effect. The morale of the remaining staff may be critical to the success of the restructure and, of course, the viability of your business moving forward. So if we have a look at our first slide, which is now not working. Okay, here we go. So what we're going to look at today is what is a genuine redundancy, your obligation to consultation, the redeployment process itself, termination of employment as a result of redundancy, and importantly, post-redundancy considerations. So I think that sometimes we get to the end of the process and we're so relieved that we've got to the end that we don't consider what happens after the redundancy. So we will speak a little bit about that as we go on as well. So what is a genuine redundancy? Well, the employer decides that it no longer requires a job that an employee has been performing to be done by that employee or by anybody else. The decision is not due to the ordinary and customary turnover of labour and leads to the termination of the employee's employment. So remember, positions are redundant, not people. It's not the employee's fault that a redundancy process may be impacting them. Other outcomes from these processes might also include redeployment, retraining, change in hours, and the termination as a result of the redundancy. So what are the employer considerations? So the employer decides that it no longer wishes the job to be done by that employee or by anybody else. And I think that's a critical point here. It's not about shifting the work from one person to another. It's about the job not being required. The decision is not due to the ordinary and customary turnover of labour, and it will lead ultimately to the termination of the employee's employment. The termination is not due to any personal act or omission of the employee, and I'll speak a little bit about that later as well, a bit more. It may result from a substantial change or reduction in duties or responsibilities. maybe a result of a significant change in a work location, or maybe the result from the transmission of business due to the sale or merger of the organisation. So let's just recap some of these points. The work cannot be done by the current employee or anybody else. Effectively, the position will no longer exist within the organisational structure. Redundancy is not part of a normal recruitment process, and redundancy is an outcome of structural change within the organisation. If a position becomes redundant, a further consequence is that the employee who fills that position has become redundant or potentially redundant at the start of the process. If there's no other suitable work available for that employee, it may be necessary to terminate the employee as a result. But termination is not the only possible outcome. As I mentioned previously, other examples could be an agreed reduction in hours or redeployment to a different position within the organisation, together with some training. So redundancy is not a result of performance, and so that's a critical space to remember that. It's about the position, not the person in the position or the way that they've performed in the role. So redundancy is not applicable where employees are employed for a stated period, a season, or for a project. Casual employees are not considered to be made redundant, so just bear that in your mind. Employees terminated for serious misconduct. Employees of a small business of fewer than 15 employees at the time of redundancy. Trainees or apprentices employed for the length of training, or when continuous service is less than 12 months. So effectively, anyone under 12 months is not able to become part of the process of redundancy. However, if the employer still needs the employee's job to be done by someone else, such as the case here, so hopefully you can see that, where the guy's actually telling the worker, losing your job managing the community centre was obviously a blow. But luckily we've come up with a volunteering opportunity for you, running your own local community centre. Well, that's a nice try, but that would not be considered a genuine redundancy. And doesn't matter how creative you are about how you think you can work a redundancy, if the job is required in any stated form, it can't be considered as a genuine redundancy. So let's look at consultation now. So in addition to the requirements contained within wards and collective agreements, the employers consult with employees. It's an important principle of fairness. So you have an obligation to consider your employees right at the start of the process. So you need to consult with the employees, and in some cases, any union to which they belong. So if your staff are aligned to a union, then that's one of the considerations you need to make at the start. So award provisions do require you to consult with employees and the unions regarding possible change to structures. Collective agreements have similar clauses as well. Modern awards require genuine consultation to include details of restructures and proposed redundancies, and are provided in writing before any final decisions are made to make an individual redundant or before finalising the changes. So consultation is an opportunity to provide staff with time to consider what this means for them and bring back some perhaps other options. So consultation is not the end of the process. So a good way of ensuring this is in your planning and preparation, remembering planning and preparation equals perfect execution. I think we can't place enough importance on the planning of these processes. So consider providing staff with a copy of the existing structure, the proposed new structure, and you should watermark that new structure as proposed, because until consultation is finished, it is only a proposed structure. Provide a background as to why the business is heading down a change path, and a timeline of organisational actions such as consultation, recruitment, and include the date that the new structure is proposed to take place. That way, staff have all the information available to them. Even where redundancy flows from the loss of funding, which in our world is often the case, it is important to remember that consultation processes are not reduced, even where decisions are not in the hands of the organisation. Consultation is mandatory. So it's a very important part of the process. So consultation doesn't mean that agreement has to be reached, but consultation does mean that there's a genuine opportunity for the affected employees to influence the decision. Agreement is desirable, but not necessary. So in genuine consultation, we need to make sure of good and excellent decision making, being fair to employees, including those who remain at the end of the process. It ensures your defence against claims of unfair dismissal or an unlawful termination or discrimination under the equal opportunity legislation. So it's important to communicate to those staff directly as well as other staff. So I think in times of change, it is important to advise your whole of organisation and then perhaps start consulting with affected staff a little bit more closely. But if you're considering just advising the staff that are affected and not the whole organisation, then I think you open yourself up to the opportunity of rumour and gossip, destabilisation in the workplace, and just generally a culture that we don't really need at a time of difficulty such as redundancy. Ensure proper and fair processes. So providing staff with written advice of meetings, and make sure you provide that ahead of time to allow the employee to arrange for a support person, for example, or really just to get their head around what this means for them. Advise the options to form the basis of the discussion. For example, any options that you've considered that are available for redeployment, or possible opportunities for redundancy as a result. So for the employer, as I've stated before, the written advice is really important. Explaining how the processes to select employees for the structure is also important for those employees. Ensuring that employees are given the opportunity to comment on the structure and suggest alternatives which may avert or mitigate its adverse effects. Clearly explaining how the proposed restructure would affect positions in the organisation and the employees. Preparing a timeline for each stage of the restructure process. This is often one of the pitfalls that organisations fall into, is not actually indicating when the process ends. So for staff that are involved in redundancies, it's important for them to have that timeline so that they know when the end of the process is near. When does the new structure start? When do I leave the organisation if I'm impacted by that outcome? Where possible, it's a good idea to appoint a liaison person to deal with the inquiries and comments from employees. So I think if you have the ability to have someone, a conduit between the business and the processes, that's a really good idea. Because what we're hoping to do in this whole process is to provide fairness for the staff that are involved and for the whole organisation. Importantly, minimise the rumours and the distraction that these processes can cause. Improve the chances of creative solutions that emerge from employee discussions. Because as I say to some members that I talk to, the best people to know about the job or the role are the people that are doing it. And sometimes we don't know every aspect of that job. So your discussions are going to be really important with staff. Quite apart from the fact that you're fostering trust and cooperation, what you're doing is impacting buy-in, and that's really important as well. It reduces stress, which can thrive in periods of uncertainty. And I think that for all of us, during these times of significant change processes, the impact on staff, whether impacted or not, is critical at those times. So let's have a look at redeployment. So redeployment is when an employer makes a decision as to which positions will become redundant, and therefore which employees will lose their position. The employer must properly consider whether any alternative positions are available for redeployment. So what do we mean by suitable alternative position? So it has to be a job at a comparable level and at a comparable condition. So if we look at that cartoon that I had up earlier, whilst he was offering the same job, it certainly wasn't at a comparable condition, given that it had gone from obviously a full-time ongoing position into a volunteering role. So it has to be comparable at both level and at condition. If there are no opportunities for redeployment, you'll need to ensure compliance with relevant notice periods for termination. And we'll have a little look at that later on in this program. The potentially redundant employee should be given preference for alternative positions, provided that they can reasonably satisfy the job requirements. I think what's important here too is that sometimes the staff that you already have may be able to reasonably satisfy the job requirements, but may not to 100%. And I think that what you need to consider is, can we get them to 100% with some additional training, with some additional mentoring and support? Because the value of having existing staff in the business is critical in terms of understanding the business, the communication, the policies and procedures. So thinking more about what the impact is for the business and the employee post-redundancy, if a bit of training and mentoring can help, I think it's a really great outcome for both parties. Redeployment is a way of retaining staff who know the organisation, and a way of demonstrating commitment to those employees is training. Failure to fully consider redeployment options can lead to a successful challenge as to the genuine nature of redundancy. So where changes to the employee's hours or any other changes are agreed to, this should be reflected in the new contract of employment. So all the changes coming out of your redundancy need to be noted in contracts, need to be noted in your new structure. So let's move on to the selection processes in the example where we need them. If the restructure involves a reduction of a number of similar positions, employers may consider the option of spill and fill selection processes. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The employer must also apply procedural fairness in recruitment and selection processes, which effectively means applying selection criteria in good faith and being aware of your EEO legislative requirements for any recruitment undertaken in these processes. So let's look a bit closely at spill and fill. You need to limit it to situations where there is a reduction in similar roles if voluntary measures are not enough. Employees who miss out on their own jobs may have a basis for an unfair dismissal claim if these processes are not managed well. So it's often a time where it can be really disruptive and demoralising, particularly if used unnecessarily. So be really mindful about these processes and about people applying for their own jobs. So there would need to be a really good reason that someone who has been undertaking a role, albeit changed in hours, for instance, it would have to be a fairly good reason as to why they would not be able to continue to do that job with the reduced hours. So just applying good employment processes is going to be critical in this space as well. So if we move to termination of employee, once all of your options have been exhausted through redundancy, decision has to be made as to the termination of the employee. The employer must give the required period of notice of termination or payment in lieu. Minimum notice periods are set out by NEFs, and they range from 1 to 5 weeks pay based on the length of service and the age of the employee. Formal notice is only given after consultation processes. So be mindful of that. Don't be considering notice period at a time where you are consulting or at a time prior to consultation. If the employee is not required to work the notice, you can terminate early and pay in lieu the balance of notice. So that's an option as well. But please check contracts for any other contractual obligations that may be sitting in the contracts for affected staff. So that's critical as well. Looking at severance pay, the federal standard for employers with more than 15 employers is listed on that slide there. Redundancy payments are as set by NES. Also, as I mentioned on the previous slide, employees' contracts or organisational policies, in fact, may provide better entitlements. So make sure that you consider those contracts ahead of any of these processes. It's critically important. As I said at the start of the process, post-redundancy is a critical part of a redundancy process. Often staff continue to be employed after the redundancy and feel various levels of emotions. These emotions can have a long-term impact on staff morale moving forward, and a key part of redundancy planning should be including some strategy for how to support remaining staff who may demonstrate some of the following emotions. So we have people who obviously feel relief, and the immediate feeling of relief, however, may not last long and can soon dissolve into other feelings. So you need to maintain ongoing and transparent communication during this time. Feelings of guilt. Whilst people are grateful to have kept their job, they're more likely to feel guilty about the friends and the colleagues that they may have lost in the process. So again, ongoing support is critical at this stage. Loss of confidence and self-esteem. Why did I keep my job? Why did my colleague lose theirs? So again, this is a space where you really need to be very impactful and insightful in how to support employees that stay with the organisation. They may feel feelings of envy, and the envy is as a result of a missed opportunity that redundancy can offer people. So whilst they've kept their job initially, they can have feelings of perhaps I should have gone down the path of some of my colleagues. Feelings of resentment. because obviously sometimes the workloads and the responsibilities change as a result of people having left their teams or having left the organisation. So how you support people through those times is critical as well. And then, of course, some people suffering from the sense of fear for the future. Are there more changes coming? Will I be next? Will my colleagues be next? So I think as responsible employers, if you think your responsibility to communicate well through the process is over on day one of your new structure, it's not. You just need to communicate differently to the remaining workforce. Communicate in ways that give them some insight into the future that lies ahead for them and the organisation. Some insight into the possible opportunities that the new structure will provide staff. And opportunities for training, to reskilling themselves. So I think how you support your staff moving beyond the redundancy is absolutely critical to the success of the process. So including some key points for contemplation for you as we come to a close in this webinar is giving reasonable written notice to employees and to their unions. Consult with employees and their unions on the impact of the proposed changes. Exploring genuine alternative options for redundancy, such as redeployment or relocation. Provide reasonable standards of redundancy benefits. Provide appropriate ancillary services, such as time off to seek alternative work, retraining opportunities and outplacement services, or even financial planning if that's going to be helpful. Ensure employees nominated for redundancy are fairly selected on an objective, unbiased basis. And as I think I've hinted at all the way through this, communicate, communicate, communicate. Mitigating the adverse effects by considering some of the following are helpful at this time as well. Perhaps consider voluntary reduction of hours as a way of moving forward. Job share opportunities, identifying other non-wage cost saving, redeployment or transfer, retraining, outplacement, and temporary changes. So I think all of these considerations need to happen at the start of your process as a way of mitigating some impact to staff. So remember though, employees also have reciprocal obligations, which include being willing to participate in the consultation process, participating in exploring alternatives to redundancy, and not being unreasonable about accepting retraining, alternative employment, redeployment, or relocation. So I think how you prepare for your redundancy will help people work with you. There's much information that you can provide them at the start. A hint at what the future might look like is all very helpful at a time for employees to consider what's being offered to them. What does this mean for me? How will my workplace look post a redundancy? Does it look like I can fit in here? So whilst they have obligations, they actually need as much information as they can possibly get to help them consider what this means for them. So in terms of the Fair Work Ombudsman, let's put this, but in terms of a potential unfair when we're talking about genuine redundancy, funding cuts will usually constitute a valid reason. So a lot of the reason for redundancy in our sector is because of funding could a valid reason. You absolutely 100% need to follow the processes of consulting with staff, exploring options with staff, providing support for them to make the whole process less onerous for them, because at the end of the process you're going to have a workforce of people who themselves have been through the process and who are now coming to work every day. How they were treated and how they see their colleagues treated through the process is going to be critical for them. So, just in closing today, I just wanted to add that none of the information that I've provided to you today should replace any other information that you've received up until this point. Please give us a call to discuss redundancy in the processes. We'd be pleased to speak to you. Send us an email if that's easier for you, but we want to be connected and we want to help you. So please give us a call and let's see how we can help you. So I'm just going to say thanks so much for listening to me today. If I can be of any help, give me a call, send me an email, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And for any upcoming information on our future webinars, please visit ja.com.au or contact any of the team on 1800 331 915. Thank you for attending today and enjoy the rest of your day.